Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on sustaining progress in primary schools. My name's Caroline Bruce and I'll be your webinar moderator today. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to give a little context about the thinking behind this webinar. There are two main reasons we've produced this webinar. First, about 2 years ago, as you all know, the UK welcomed a significant number of refugees, particularly from Ukraine, Afghanistan and Hong Kong. Schools have done an incredible job welcoming and supporting these new arrivals and other new arrivals from all over who have themselves done an amazing job embracing a new life and culture and a new language. And yet, as these multilingual learners progress in school, English can become ever more demanding and complex and requires more explicit instruction. Secondly, Ofsted's new inspection toolkit places renewed emphasis on schools' EAL provision. You can see that on page 20. And supporting language development so that pupils can fully access the curriculum. For that reason, we've invited both teachers and school leaders to join us today, and we hope there'll be something valuable here for everyone. Our speakers today are Emily Curran and Sheila Hopkins. Emily joined the Bell Foundation as a trainer in September 2018. Prior to joining the foundation, she worked in English language teaching and taught both adults and young learners in the UK and Thailand respectively, before going on to become a teacher trainer in the ELT sector. Emily has a CELTA and Delta and also worked closely with Cambridge Refugee Resettlement Campaign as a liaison for the English language provision. Her work for the foundation has included developing training and resources for both the EAL and ESOL programmes, and she's worked extensively around assessment. And Sheila Hopkins. Sheila's been with the Bell Foundation since 2020. She holds an MA in TESOL plus qualifications in primary education and EAL training. She has worked as an EAL specialist in schools and as an EAL tutor in initial teacher training programmes and TESOL courses at the university level in the United States. Her EAL work with the foundation focuses on initial teacher education, early career teachers and senior leaders, and she also works very closely with our team of licensed practitioners. And so it gives me really great pleasure to hand over to Sheila first and then to Emily.
Great. Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be here today with all of you this afternoon. So Emily and I have decided to divide the webinar today into two different sections. As Caroline said, I will be doing the first one, where I will be looking at the shifts that occur in language, in an identity, and in scaffolding as learners move beyond early English acquisition. And then Emily will take it from the second half, where she will look at sustaining progress and exploring more about how to plan for language development, and also highlighting some linguistic challenges and some classroom support strategies as well. Okay, so thought it would be nice to just start with a scenario that many of you may recognize in your classrooms or your schools. And so here we have Oksana, who she arrived 2 years ago after coming here from Ukraine. She is fluent in Ukrainian, but when she came here, spoke very little English when she arrived. But now she is really settled into school. She has lots of friends. She participates great in the classroom. And she seems to be thriving and really quite fluent in English. However, when faced with extended classroom assignments like extended writing or reading more complex texts in English, there seem to be a few gaps that appear. And you might start to actually realize that some of that conversational fluency in English is not necessarily sufficient for really fully being able to access the curriculum. You might also feel that some of the early language development in English that she has experienced is somewhat plateauing now. And so I thought, let's explore a little bit with what might be going on here and what we can possibly do as teachers and leaders to continue our support for her. As learners move beyond early English acquisition, there are some shifts that occur. And I'm going to look at 3 of these today. There's some shifts that occur in language that gets used, a shift in identity as one begins to use that language, and then shifts in scaffolding that are required for language development. So we'll focus on each in turn, and I'm going to start with looking at the shift that takes place in language. So to help us conceptualize this a bit more, I'm going to, in terms of what we mean by language proficiency, I'm going to use the EAL assessment framework from the Bell Foundation, which many of you are familiar with. The proficiency bands from A to E, as you can see here, as well as looking at some of the descriptors for each of those proficiency bands in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And this, I'm hoping, will really help us to actually see the type of shift in language that needs to occur for someone like Oksana to more fully access and be successful with the curriculum. Okay, we know that learners who are at bands A and B in English language proficiency score significantly below the national average in attainment in England. And this makes sense since, our instruction is in English here. Those who are developing competence in English are close, but are still under the national average. And then multilingual learners who are at bands E and D score significantly above the national average, which really demonstrates the benefits of multilingualism. And in this webinar, we're going to focus our attention onto learners like Oksana who really have developed that early stages of English acquisition at band B, but are now starting to develop competency and move to bands C and D, really, and the support that they will need as they continue to make that progress. Okay, so let's look a bit more closely at what we mean by this language development. I'm going to look and examine the shift between, or looking at the shift of language as learners move from early stages into that developing competency. And I'm going to start by sharing a descriptor from speaking. And there's 10 descriptors, but I just want you to look at this one. And I'll put this up on here, and I want, if you could just read it and try to consider in your heads, you don't have to write anything, but consider what is different between the language in band B and C for speaking. Okay, so you might have come up with this, maybe in terms of speaking in band B, it's on familiar topics, but once we go into band C, it becomes some speaking tasks within subject content. Okay, which the next one is writing. Again, look at the differences between the language and consider what might be different here. Okay. Again, in band B, you're writing more simple sentences on personal topics for purposes. And then once you get into band C and even further in band D, you're starting to do more connected texts and for classroom purposes. Okay. And finally, let's look at one for reading. Okay, and here we see again, band B kind of reading everyday type of language with familiar structures. But once we get into band C, then the language becomes more subject area texts and more complex structures. Okay, so we really see the significant shift between bands B and C. Language at band B is often developed through social interactions and everyday experiences, perhaps even through social media and friends. And it typically takes around 1 to 2 years to acquire. Oksana has definitely developed proficiency in this area. But in contrast, language in band C and increasingly into band D, right, becomes what we refer to more as school-based language or academic language. And developing this type of language requires explicit instruction. And it can take 5 to 7 years to do so. It's at this level where some learners' progress may seem to plateau, especially where they are not receiving the type of scaffolding that they really need to develop this language. And furthermore, the challenge here is not just limited to multilingual learners. Some of our first language English speakers who might experience the same challenge with learning this more academic language. Students won't naturally make this shift. Many of them won't naturally make this. And our role as teachers is to really bridge the everyday conversational language with that more academic language, deliberately moving back and forth, using all of the language students bring to the classroom in order to develop new concepts and increasingly, develop new language skills. Okay. So let's see what this looks like in the classroom. I'm going to show you two texts. The first one is Oksana orally explaining a topic from history, and you can read it, just very short. It's clear that she understands the content of the lesson and is able to communicate and discuss things in the classroom. But the second one now is a text that she's expected to read, and more typical of what we might want her to eventually write. And we can see here how this second text is more dense, more abstract, less conversational, and more representative of perhaps what we think disciplinary text. So this shift in language is what occurs as students move beyond early English acquisition, okay? And however, it's not the only shift that is taking place because language development can also involve a shift in identity. We know that language is deeply connected to identity. It's how we express who we are, show where we belong, and are recognized or misrecognized, or maybe even not recognized by others. And as learners develop more complex school-based English, their sense of self may also change. For some, that shift might feel really empowering, right? But for others, it can feel maybe a bit unsettling or even threatening. Multilingual learners, as you all know, are a really highly diverse group. So their experiences with this is going to vary. But what remains constant is that identity evolves alongside linguistic growth. And in exploring this idea, I will draw primarily on the work of Bonnie Norton. And she starts by saying first that that the way we speak signals who we are and where we belong. So one's language or accent or dialect can all reflect one's culture and community or region. And so for multilingual learners, and for even some of our monolingual English-speaking learners, moving between home language and academic school-based language is a movement between worlds, and it requires navigating these worlds. And this shift carries meaning. It carries meaning about belonging and identity and inclusion. Another dimension of identity shift appears in how students use language. Through language, they position themselves socially. And through language use, they are signaling where and with whom they belong, okay? And even for primary students and learners, could be somewhat subconscious, but it's happening in their minds. And at the same time, these same students are positioned by others. So a learner may feel as if they're labeled as limited in English or foreign or less competent by possibly teachers or students or others, right? And they may feel like their home language is only acceptable during break time or lunchtime, or maybe even perhaps not at all in a school. And they may find it just too risky or threatening to try to use language that they aren't confident with. The other day, I was speaking to a multilingual teacher who speaks herself Urdu and English, and she was saying how often her Urdu-speaking learners will say phrases like "close the lights" or "I've done sick," because that's the exact literal translation between English and Urdu, and families often say that. And she was explaining that if she simply were to say that those expressions were wrong or incorrect, then she risks implying that the family, and by extension, the child really, and their identity is wrong or somewhat incorrect. So on the other hand, though, if she recognizes that that translation was actually quite smart and valid, and there's multiple, different ways in how we say it here, then she's affirming that pupil's language and practices and identity as legitimate. Okay. We also need to recognize that language varieties are not equally valued, right? Some are privileged while others are marginalized. And in schools, we tend to teach what we call standard English, right? National curriculum says that. And sometimes that dismisses other varieties as inappropriate, informal, or need of correction. And these judgments reflect social power. And as a result, some students may really feel that using academic language requires distancing themselves from their home or peer identities. And this is something that we should never make learners feel that they have to choose between these worlds. As teachers and leaders, we need to communicate to students that they can and they do hold multiple identities at once. Okay. And that they being able to navigate between those worlds and be flexible within those is really a genuine asset and skill. So developing academic English does not mean giving up who they are. And we recognize that a learner's full linguistic repertoire, if we recognize that as legitimate and something that we do move back and forth between in school, then academic language becomes an additive thing rather than subtractive. Okay. And finally, language is also connected to who our students imagine they might become. Okay, academic English is linked to pathways like universities and careers, but at primary level, it's linked to you can be like a scientist or a historian or a writer, right? And students are more likely to invest in it when they see that that's part of their future. If it feels alien or exclusionary or like it's for someone else, that motivation drops. So learning language is, in a sense, part of constructing a possible future self. And we need to help learners envision those future identities as possibilities and something that they are included in. Okay, so moving beyond early English acquisition is not just about language development. It also involves identity work. And the issue is not whether our students are capable of developing academic language, but it's more the question is whether schools and classrooms can validate all the languages and varieties of languages and create the conditions in which academic language is made more visible and feels attainable and inclusive. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we attain that? And this is where our third shift occurs. It comes in because appropriate scaffolding can really help to reduce the threat of identity risk while also supporting language development. And that's why it's down here at the bottom of the image. But many schools and classrooms, the teachers might tend to kind of let go of scaffolding once learners appear fluent, like Oksana. Really, right? But as we know, that academic language is much more complex and takes a lot longer to develop. And so because of this thing, scaffolding should not disappear at all. But what needs to happen is that it too needs to shift, okay, based on a learner's proficiency in English. And this can also really benefit all learners in your classroom. So what does this shift look like in the classroom? Well, first, our focus on the type of language needs to shift. When learners are new to English at bands A and B, we oftentimes modify our language, we simplify texts, we use concrete vocabulary, we use heavily scaffolded sentence frames, lots of visuals, all of those things that you are using. But as students start to develop competency, right, at bands C and D, then our focus needs to shift to helping students navigate more complex curricular texts, okay, where we highlight the academic language structures, where we deconstruct complex sentences and model language use. And all of this Emily will speak about later here. But multilingual learners can often struggle here because they are asked to produce and engage with language that they really have never seen or practiced. Okay, another shift that needs to occur with scaffolding is how we support the use of home language. When learners are new at bands A and B to English, we use home language primarily for translating purposes. We translate whole texts, or we have students write their own texts in their home language while they're at the same time learning English. But, you know, TAs might work with them and translate materials, or we might partner them with a learner who shares a common home language to share content and meaning. However, as students again start to developing English and they have those skills, competency in English, then their home language becomes more of a cognitive resource where learners can move back and forth, right, between the languages. Sometimes we call this translanguaging. We should not give up using that home language because it's a really important resource for these learners. They might discuss new concepts in whatever language they prefer to go deeper with things before they read or write in English, right? They may use their home language or whatever language they prefer to take notes or to label things, or to analyze their language and compare it with English, like here, red car or coche rojo in Spanish, where the adjectives go either in front or behind, okay? And then also at the end here, your oral and written feedback or your interactions also need to shift as they develop language in English. For bands A and B, we typically focus on meaning, right? And we affirm language use, whatever they are producing, right? As we can see here, you might ask a student, what did you do today? I go to cafeteria, I go to math, I go to classroom. That's great. You went to a lot of places. I hope you had a great day or a good day, right? So you're focusing in on meaning and communication. But as learners progress into band C and D, you want to focus on both meaning and language development and expansion. For example, a student before writing might offer, the animal skin hides it so that other animals don't eat it, right? And the teacher can reply, that's a great idea. Affirming it, right? You're inviting them into that kind of academic world. You're explaining one way that animals stay safe from predators, right? You're kind of reframing it there. Their skin or fur hides them, moving back and forth between the language they bring and then the other. In science, we call that camouflage, right? And you might actually want to capture some of those versions if they, can support them later on when they do independent writing. And feedback on a learner's writing also needs to shift from responding to meaning at bands A and B to then providing feedback on both content and language as they get into bands C and D. Okay, so a lot of information there, but I'm going to give you a minute on the next slide to kind of think about what some of the implications of these shifts might mean to you for whether you're a teacher or a school leader here, depending upon your role. And so I will give you some time to look at this before turning it over to Emily. Go ahead and read this. Okay, so hopefully some good takeaways today. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll let Emily get her slides up. We also will, along with the recording that we send out to you tomorrow or the webinar, we'll also have some resources available to you as well, like the assessment framework and some strategies and that type of thing too. A whole school evaluation. We'll put all of those things in the email. Okay, so over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Sheila.
Yeah.
Super. So as Sheila said, we're going to be looking at some kind of in a bit more detail now about sort of the planning and sort of looking a bit more closely at the linguistic challenges at this kind of level, moving beyond early acquisition and also the classroom support, so what you can kind of do there. So just to sort of start by introducing our principles, because it does well to underpin this part of the section and sort of link back into what Sheila was talking about. So our third principle has is an integrated focus on content and language. There's a QR code if you're interested in going to the principles, but that's kind of what we're going to be using today to look at the second part of this webinar. Because we know that learners develop English most effectively when they're engaged in mainstream classroom curriculum. And so obviously that means that teachers and curriculum designers across all subjects need to plan not only for the curriculum content, as Sheila was saying, but also for the language demands that come with that content, so that learners can fully access and engage with the learning. So we'll see how identifying the language demands of the curriculum will help you better scaffold language development in a lesson. And that's, as I said, what we're going to be focusing on now. So thinking first about kind of like planning. So planning to support language development alongside the curriculum. And we can think first about our curriculum objectives. And that obviously will look at the purpose of the text or the tasks that students are engaging in. It's closely linked, sorry. So we'll look at the curriculum, and then we can think, well, what is the purpose or function of this task that we're doing? So for example, that might be to recount, to retell, to explain, describe, compare, argue or justify, to inform, to predict, to discuss. So there are, as I'm sure you'll be very well aware, many different purpose or functions to different, not only texts that students have to read, but also write and also engage with in discussion as well. So for example, retell a story, as I said. And obviously this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure that there will be many more that you can think of, as I'm speaking right now. But it's this identifying the purpose or the function of the task or the text is a really important first stage in understanding the language demands of the curriculum, because different functions and purposes will typically have particular vocabulary, sentence structures, and ways of structuring texts associated with them. So we start with our curriculum objectives, we move on then to think about the purpose, and then once we've identified the purpose of the text or a task, we can then identify the particular language associated with it at the text, sentence and word level. So here we see the development of language involves much more than just learning vocabulary. So students need to learn new grammar, new text types, different language patterns associated within those subject areas. And we know obviously that everyone's context is different, and that in some schools some of this will be the responsibility of the curriculum designers, and in others it will sit more with teachers, but that it's useful for everyone to kind of become aware of the language that students will need to engage with the curriculum and move beyond the early stages of English language acquisition. So, for example, we've got lots of different texts. If we're thinking about the text level, different texts will be structured differently. So we've got, for example, a recipe will have a list of ingredients and then it will have steps to follow. Or a story will have an introduction, a complication, and a resolution. A newspaper article will have an introduction and be followed by a sequence series of events. So all of these structures of these texts will be different depending on what it is that the purpose of those texts are. Likewise, sentences have different structures based on their purpose. So, for example, there's language used to compare or contrast. So we can see here, for example, so something and something are like because the difference between X and Y is one similarity or difference is. So this is a kind of language associated with the purpose of comparing. We'll always similarly will have other language to predict. So I think will happen because, or if happens, then might happen next, and so on. We've also got language that will be used specifically to classify. So some have all and are and sounds a bit strange. Decontextualized, as I'm sure you can appreciate. So it's important to be able to obviously integrate this within the curriculum, but these structures will come up where again and again where classification is used. And the important thing to say here, so a few more just to exemplify language used to solve equations, for example. But the important thing to know here is that learners developing English might not have developed these types of sentence structures yet at this stage, and that's what we want to support them with. So they might know the curriculum content and what it is that they want to say, but they might not yet be able to do this in the way that we're expecting of them at this stage. So that's why we need to provide some structured supports. So we're going to have another look now again at sort of an oversight of what identifying language demands at the text, sentence and word level looks like in practice. So let's take this text on how honey is made, and this might be linked to the curriculum, for example, thinking about ecosystems and pollinated crops. And I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to read it to yourself. And if you want to either think to yourself or let me know in the chat box, what would you say is the purpose of this text? Okay, I can start to see a couple of ideas coming in. So to inform, educate, to explain, to inform, information text, sequencing, inform. So inform the process of making honey. Right. So we have, yeah, exactly. We've marked this down as being an explanation, but in a sense, it's kind of all of the things that you've said. It's informing. It's also an explanation, and as somebody else said, sequencing. So you're definitely right that if we think about the text level, that sequencing is involved there, which we'll come to in just a moment. But at the text level, we can see then that there's a clear structure. So it's made of an introduction and then an explanation sequence, as we just mentioned, of 5 different steps, and then a closing statement. So that's a sort of typical structure for this type of explanation. And then at the sentence level, the text uses a lot of sequencing language, as you've pointed out, to clearly structure the 5 different steps in the explanation. So we've got, for example, the first step in making honey begins when, after filling their sacs with these sweet juices, the house bees then add, over time, lastly, and so on. And then if we think about the word level, it's important to consider, obviously, not only the tier 3 words, which you would probably want to teach anyway, but also being aware of possible challenges with tier 2 words and groups of words that come together, like, for example, stored in and regurgitated into, and so on. So as an overview, this is kind of how we might think to analyze or understand the language demands at in terms of the purpose, the text level, the sentence level, and word level. And so how can we help students then? Well, they'll need to be taught how they're structured for different purposes. And we can clearly communicate the purpose of the text, how it's organized by, for example, showing them and adding this to part of the lesson, labeling the different parts of the text before they read it, so that this will then allow them more space to concentrate on the meaning of the text. And you might want to do this as a whole class together, or maybe provide it specifically for learners who need it. And it would also help learners at Band C to have text markers, as we can see here, that begin each of the 5 steps. And this again would help to reduce the cognitive load and allow space for meaning making. Another feature of academic language that can be tricky for learners are sentences which have a lot of information in them, like we can see here, taken from the honey text. So after filling their sacs with these sweet juices, the filled bees fly back to their beehive and the stored nectar is regurgitated into the mouth of house bees. So there's a lot of information in this one sentence. And it can really help. How we help students? We can help them to deconstruct these complex sentences together by focusing on meaning rather than grammar, and by using a set of meaning-making prompts. So, for example, you might want to ask who or what are we talking about here? So we're talking about the field bees, and then we can underline that. And we can ask, what's happening? They're flying back to the beehive. And we can then ask, when is this happening? Oh, it's happening after they've filling their sacs with the sweet juices. And then we might want to ask or point out that there's this word, this connective and, it introduces another sentence which will have more information. So we ask again, who or what? So we're talking then about the nectar. What's happening to the nectar? It's regurgitated, and where? Into the mouth of the house bees. And of course, it's important to say that you wouldn't do this with every single sentence that your learners are likely to come across, but doing it every so often can help to demonstrate to students the types of questions that you or they themselves might want to ask as you unpack these more information-packed, dense sentences, so that they can make meaning out of it. I'm sure you all know you're not strangers to the use of colour for using, as we've got here as well. So also make use of that to support learners with the unpacking and the kind of compartmentalizing of the sentences. Another thing that learners can do is to make their own sentences using similar prompts. So, for example, who or what field bees? What are they doing? They're flying. When? In the summer. Where? 2 or 3 miles from their hive. And why? To collect the nectar. From where? In their sacs. So it can be really useful to have learners use these prompts to create these longer sentences themselves. And it will need, this will take maybe some time, and it will help them to develop their language, doing this repeatedly over time. So at the word level then, a sort of quite prominent challenge for our learners moving beyond band B or beyond early acquisition, and in fact from even before that, are words that have multiple meanings. So in addition to the tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary that you'll already be teaching your learners, worth being aware of these words that can have more than one meaning. So for example, honey might be a name that your nana calls you, or a solution has a very different meaning in maths than it does in science. Nectar, a child might have heard, they might go to shopping with their mum at Sainsbury's and know about the nectar card. To store in this context means to keep somewhere, but they've heard the word store to mean a shop, and so on, as we can see here in these examples. So these types of words do tend to increase as learners progress through schooling, and they should be recognised as possible barriers to meaning. So you can help learners by seeing if they can find them, by sort of skimming through a text and highlighting them, or if not, then highlighting them yourself and supporting learners to unpack the meaning of those in the context of the topic that you're looking at. So we're going to have we've had a look at the honey example at text, sentence and word level. We'll have another look now at another example, so we can see it in different sort of topic context. And we'll look this time at the context of an information writing report for Year 2, and this is based on some materials by Derianka. So I'll just give you a little bit of background information before I show you the text and give you a chance to read it. So this text I'm about to show you is an assignment, part of a Year 2 curriculum where learners are writing an information report on a mammal of their choice. And to model what learners are expected to write, the teacher first had the whole class read an exemplar report on cats, as you might expect, and likely would do similarly in your own lessons. However, here we also want to identify the language demands of the exemplar text at text, sentence, and word level. And hopefully that will help us to identify the type of language that they'll need to know when it comes for them to write their own information report later on. So just to briefly summarize, the exemplar text on cats, where part of the curriculum is that learners will then later be writing an information report on a mammal of their choice. So I'll just give you a moment to familiarize yourself with this now, and then we'll go on to look at the text, sentence, and word level in a moment. Okay, so we'll come back to that now. So we can then think first about the purpose of the text. So the purpose of this text is to inform or to classify, and we can see that it's structured with an introductory paragraph, followed by 4 paragraphs with descriptive information on cats, on their habitats, characteristics, diet, and behavior. At the sentence level, we can see the report uses present tense structures. So cats live in, cats have, cats eat. This tense is used to explain things that are always true. And it's important to recognize that they won't be writing about their own cat using language like my cat, for example. And instead, they're going to be talking about cats in general. And so there's language that goes along with that, like all cats and wild cats, pet cats, most cats, feral cats, domesticated cats, some cats. And there are also long sentences that combine lots of information here. So, for example, most cats have 4 legs, sharp teeth, a tail, and are covered in hair. Or the color of their hair may be brown, black, orange, white, or a combination. There's a lot of information packed into those sentences. And learners will need support with how to combine information like this before they write their own report. And finally, at the word level, it's important to consider not only the tier 3 words, which you obviously would teach, but also recognize that learners will need to use descriptive language or adjectives to provide information about characteristics or behaviors. So sharp teeth, white, short, long, small, curious, and so on. And whilst this might seem like a lot of planning for a lesson, you don't need to be a linguist to identify the language demands. And in time and through practice, you'll become much more aware of the language demands of your curriculum. Additionally, in terms of supporting you to analyze the language demands of your subject or your curriculum or the topic that you're teaching at the time, you might want to draw on generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Gemini, Claude, or you're one of your choice if you use generative AI. And it could be used as a sort of linguistic assistant. So a useful resource to draw on for busy teachers, especially those you know, if you're a little bit less confident in terms of identifying language demands. So just going on a sort of slight sidestep, looking at how we use generative AI as a linguistic assistant now, and then I will come back to the supports that would be useful to help learners to write the text we just looked at, their own text relating to cats that we just looked at. So we actually use generative AI to analyze the cat text that we've just shown you, asking it for its purpose, asking it to analyze the linguistic features of the text, sentence, and word level. So very much looking at what we've just actually done ourselves. And here you can see the results, which identified the text as an information report, and gave the structure and purpose of each paragraph at the text level, so to inform or to educate, and then the structure, as we said before. And then at the sentence level, it identified the use of present tense, generalized subjects, simple and compound sentences, and the use of listing, which we've looked at the types of adjectives that will be needed, for example, for describing the different characteristics of the cats. And at the word level, it also looked at the technical vocabulary, so that would be some of that tier 3 vocabulary. And then, as we said, adjectives for describing characteristics, and actually really there's some overlap between those and the use of listing as at the sentence level as well. So that really just took seconds to retrieve, and it provided a sort of generally not too bad analysis actually of the language demands of that text. But we are aware that AI results are only as good as the prompts provided. So it's useful if you use AI, and maybe some of you are already using AI in this way. It would be really interesting to hear. But basically be specific. So the more specific you are, the more focused results are likely to be. In terms of the prompts, obviously, if they're useful prompts and you find ones that give you really useful results, then it might be a good idea to save those prompts and just swap out any of the words needed. Obviously, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it's important to treat the results with caution, because generative AI, obviously, it does hallucinate sometimes. It doesn't have all the answers or always know best practice. So take what it says with a pinch of salt. But having said that, it can be a useful starting point. And obviously, of course, never give it any personal information, because we just still don't know what's being done with that. And I'm sure that goes without saying. But coming back then to the classroom support then for our cat text. So I just kind of wanted to take you on a journey of how you might want to use AI to support with analysing the linguistic demands, and then thinking now about what classroom support can be used. So we've identified our language demands, and we are going to look at how to support with those. So the renewed focus on oracy in schools is particularly useful for learners actually, and we'll be thinking about that here, as it encourages those opportunities for students to move back and forth, as Sheila was talking about earlier, between everyday language and the target language that learners are developing. So prior to reading an information report, you might have learners discuss any facts that they know about cats, allowing them to use their preferred language. And then based on the structure of the cat's text, you can continue the conversations by using a graphic organizer like we've got here. So what do cats look like? What do cats eat? What do cats do? Where do cats live, for example? And have learners make notes. So cats are soft, they're really furry. My cat loves tuna. They meow. And basically using this everyday language to structure these conversations before looking at the report allows the whole class to build up concepts and factual knowledge of cats in everyday language that they understand and can access, prior to being introduced to the academic vocabulary that then gets used in the text. So for example, for what the cats looks like, that's characteristics. What do they eat? Diet. What do they do? Behavior. Where do they live? Habitat. So we're scaffolding learners to use what they know in language that they know before we're then filling in the gaps with that academic language. At the sentence level, knowing that the information report generally uses I can't get it out. Knowing that the information report uses generalized nouns, for example, like all cats, some cats, most cats, because we analysed that before, we know that we want our learners to use that language. So we can then input that here or explicitly model it. So we had, for example, my cat loves tuna, and that will become, oh, most cats love tuna. Or my cat scratches. Yeah, absolutely. And when we're writing a report, we can say all cats can scratch, and so on. And at the word level, knowing that learners need to use descriptive vocabulary because we've done that analysis beforehand, we can then input that language here. So we've got here on the left, some cats have hair. Well, then we can input what kind of hair: striped hair, striped shiny hair, or they have tails. Okay, what kinds of tails? Straight long tails, for example. And again, as I said before, like if we've done the analysis of the language needed beforehand, we can then use this kind of scaffolding to input, support, and the extra bits. And at the sentence level, we looked at the text as having sentences that were very compact with information. So like these ones that we had here. So most cats have 4 legs, sharp teeth, a tail, and are covered in hair. So using the language that you've already expanded on with the descriptive adjectives, so some cats have striped shiny tails, for example, you can have students practice creating extended noun phrases themselves. So for example, cats, you might start with cats and then what cats, some cats. Some cats have long tails, some cats have long striped tails. Some domestic cats have long striped tails. And these kinds of challenges can be quite fun for learners to give them a chance to sort of play with the language. See who can come up with the longest phrase, for example. And then when it comes time for them to write their own reports, they will already have practiced creating these long, dense, or compact sentences in terms of meaning, long sentences in context, and also will have rehearsed them orally, which is really important. And then finally, going back to the text level, we can clearly tell learners that the purpose of the text at the beginning, so highlighting the structure before they read, and that can greatly reduce their cognitive load so that they have more space to focus on meaning. You might want to also unpack the introduction paragraph by reading it together, maybe having learners read the remaining paragraphs in pairs. And then after reading, you could ask them to try and find generalized nouns, compound sentences as a further focus on language, for example. So when it comes time for learners to write their own information reports, after we've done all of that kind of work to support and scaffold, they should be better prepared after developing the kind of language at the text, sentence, and word level that they need. And this will give them lots of models to refer back to. And a kind of final note here to say that we recognise it's not possible to address every language demand within a single lesson, but that by identifying and focusing on just 1 or 2 language features at a time, you can gradually build both your own awareness of language and your learners' development of the academic language needed. And then over time, as we said, this understanding will accumulate and transfer across other curriculum activities. So start small, as we said here, 1 brick at a time. You might want to focus on just extending a noun phrase with your students, for example, or maybe working together to deconstruct a long sentence with a lot of information in it. And then taken together, these focus practices can help learners move beyond the early stages of English language acquisition. And as Sheila did at the end of her section, I'm just going to give you a moment then to read this kind of summary slide and consider kind of what the implications might be for you, depending on what your role is. So I'll just give you a minute to read that now. And thank you. I'll pass over to Caroline. I apologise, I haven't read any of the chat, so I'm just trying to catch up on that. And my light in my room just automatically went off halfway through. So sorry, I've been sitting in the dark. But yeah, that's thank you, and I'll just pass you back over to Caroline.
Thanks so much, Emily, and to Sheila too. It was a really, really great session. There was so much in the session. I feel relieved that everybody will get the recording, to be able to go back and make really good use of that. We haven't actually had any questions, amazingly, which I can only assume means that you've covered absolutely everything that could have been anticipated. And gave real clarity. So thank you both hugely. I've just got a couple of slides to whiz through before we finish. I'm really grateful to everybody for hanging on. And we mentioned at the very start that one of our motivations around creating this webinar was thinking about the inclusion of EAL in the Ofsted toolkit. And certainly a couple of people have mentioned about vocabulary during the webinar today. So you'll see we've got a web page on Ofsted. If you haven't already seen that, you might find it really useful. Mark Sims, who is still an Ofsted inspector and he was the former lead inspector for EAL, shares his insights and about the toolkit and what it means for schools. And there's also other interviews and articles and resources that you might find useful in guiding your school with its preparations. And we will be adding to those, including specifically around teaching around language and vocabulary. So it's definitely worth revisiting that page. And then just to let you know about the next webinar that we've got coming up. We're really, really excited to be welcoming Sabina Little to speak about her work on exploring spaces for multilingualism. And this is part of our work for the National Year of Reading. So as I mentioned already, all of these links will be shared with you in the email that goes out tomorrow. And then we've got 2 courses coming up. You can see both of those are our own courses. There are online courses that run over a period of 4 weeks, and they're both quite strategic courses. We'll be publishing our calendar for courses for the next academic year coming up soon. If you're newer to our training offer, you might be wondering why we run so few courses, and the reason that is because we've got quite a large team of licensed practitioners who run the Bell Foundation courses in their own region. So do take a look at the web page to find out what training's available near you, or contact your closest licensed practitioner to see if they're able to support you. And in fact, we have got a call out at the moment for new partners. So if you are interested in becoming a licensed practitioner with us, we can let you know about that as well. And I did mention that we'd be incredibly grateful for any feedback. So we've got a QR code on the next slide with the link to the post-course survey. I'll just pop that in the chat as well. And we do use, we do use those surveys. So if you are able to, they're very, very short. if you share your reflections, your recommendations about how webinars can be improved, your suggestions for content for future webinars, we'd be really grateful. So I think that just leaves time to say a massive thank you to Emily and Sheila again. And thank you all for coming on such a sunny evening. The courses are not for a full day. I've just seen a question coming in. The courses they run over a period of 4 weeks with one webinar that's in the middle. If you go onto the website, if you click on that link, it will tell you some more information, but they're 3-part courses. So there's some online content, there's a webinar, and then there's an assessment as part 3, and like an assignment that you get feedback on then. So yeah, hopefully that was useful. And thanks ever so much, everybody. Enjoy your evening.